I am Martin Picard, and on behalf of CME Outfitters, I would like to welcome you and to thank you for joining us for today's session entitled Real-World Evidence, Cyclin-Dependent Kinase 4/6 Inhibitors in Hormone Receptor-Positive Metastatic Breast Cancer. Today's activity is brought to you by CME Outfitters, an award-winning accredited provider of continuing education for clinicians worldwide. I am an honorary professor of oncology at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and I'm also the scientific director of the Jules Bordet Institute. I am also the co-founder of the Breast International Group. Today, we have two learning objectives. The first one is to analyze real-world evidence in terms of study validity, study design, and data source to accurately interpret findings in an oncology setting. Our second learning objective is to assess evidence on real-world clinical experience for CDK4/6 inhibitors in metastatic breast cancer. We are now going to watch a brief animation on real-world evidence and the role it plays in oncology.
In oncology, real-world evidence, or RWE, refers to evidence derived from the use and analysis of real-world data, or RWD, which are data obtained outside the context of randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. While RCTs are the gold standard for assessing the efficacy of new cancer therapies, the importance of RWE in oncology has been increasing, with the growing recognition that RCTs might not always accurately reflect the general cancer patient population. In fact, in oncology, up to 2/3 of real-world patients are not represented by RCTs. It is unclear whether findings from RCTs can be generalized to these patients, and whether real-world patients respond to treatments in the same way as clinical trial participants. Here's where RWE can help. RWE may be more generalizable to patients in clinical practice and can aid in better understanding the impact of drugs while providing information on long-term follow-up and chronic use. Appropriate use of RWE can supplement traditional clinical research to aid in clinical decision-making, offer insights into treatment selection, and improve access to therapy for underserved patient populations.
In traditional evidence-based medicine, hierarchies have been established to rate the strength of evidence of a particular clinical study methodology. Randomized clinical trials are considered to provide higher quality evidence compared to non-randomized intervention studies, observational studies, non-experimental studies, or expert opinions, because of their rigorous methodology and because of the randomized setting, which eliminates both measured and unmeasured confounding. As you know, meta-analyses are thought to provide the next level of high-quality evidence, but they can suffer from the inclusion of poor quality randomized clinical trials. As reminded by this graph, new medicines are typically approved following years of a stepwise clinical development, which culminates in the conduct of well-powered randomized clinical trials that have to demonstrate improved efficacy and/or safety for these new medicines in comparison to a well-established control treatment. Post-approval, the new medicines are being used in the real-world setting. There is increasing interest today to produce real-world evidence on the benefit and risk of recently approved medicines once they are being used post the authorization phase. This is particularly important for oncology drugs, as many of these drugs have a narrow benefit versus harm ratio, and also as many of these drugs are clearly very expensive. Real-world data can be derived from a variety of sources, including safety studies, observational studies, pragmatic trials, registries, pharmacoeconomic studies, but increasingly they are being based on the review of electronic health records. It is possible that in the future, real-world data will also be generated through social media or through patient-powered research networks. I mean here online platforms run by patients to collect and share their own clinical data. Now, the growing interest in real-world data comes from the recognition of the limitations of randomized clinical trials. Approximately 2/3 of real-world patients are not represented by randomized clinical trials. Randomized clinical trials may not include individuals with significant comorbidities, living in remote regions, belonging to advanced age groups, or individuals of racial and ethnic diversity. Now I would like the audience to get involved. You will see a question on your screen and you can vote. Let us now review some studies that evaluated real-world evidence on benefit risk associated with the use of CDK4/6 inhibitors in advanced hormone receptor-positive breast cancer. We are going to discuss today 5 target populations. Older women, women treated at academic centers but outside clinical trials, women treated in community practices in the United States, heavily pre-treated women, and last but not least, male patients with breast cancer. Let us start with the first target population, older women. Now, older women represent a substantial proportion of breast cancer patients. Unfortunately, they are underrepresented in randomized clinical trials. We have not found published real-world data on older women treated with CDK4/6 inhibitors so far. However, there is a very interesting FDA pooled analysis across 3 registration trials that has focused on these older women. The 3 trials are Paloma 2, Mona Lisa 2, and Monarch 3. Here we can see all the randomized clinical trials that have compared endocrine treatment alone or endocrine treatment plus a CDK4/6 inhibitor in advanced luminal breast cancer. These trials have been conducted in the first-line setting or in the second or third-line setting. The 3 trials that were examined closely by the FDA are Paloma 2, which involved palbociclib, Mona Lisa 2, which involved ribociclib, and Monarch 3, which involved abemaciclib. And you can see that these are all first-line trials. From this FDA analysis, we can see that a total of 1,000 827 women were recruited in the 3 studies. About 1/3 of those received an aromatase inhibitor alone, a total of 552 women. About 2/3 of the patients, or 931, received an aromatase inhibitor plus a CDK4/6 inhibitor. If we now examine these patient populations according to age, we can see that among the women who received an aromatase inhibitor alone, 136 were older than 70, and among those, only 54 were older than 75. If we now turn to the group of women who received an aromatase inhibitor plus a CDK4/6 inhibitor, we can see that only 232 of these women were older than 70, and among those, 101 were older than 75. What are the results? What we can see here are progression-free survival curves according to age group and according to the treatment received, namely endocrine treatment alone or plus a CDK4/6 inhibitor. On the left, women older than 70 have been compared to women younger than 70. And what we can see is that these older women clearly derive a benefit from the addition of a CDK4/6 inhibitor to an aromatase inhibitor. As a matter of fact, they even seem to do better than the younger patients, although this is a dangerous retrospective comparison. But what we can see is that the upper curve refers to women older than 70 receiving a CDK4/6 inhibitor, and the third curve refers to these same women older than 70 treated with an aromatase inhibitor alone. On the right, women older than 75 are being compared to women younger than 75. And it is remarkable to see that they do derive exactly the same magnitude of benefit from the addition of the CDK4/6 inhibitor to the aromatase inhibitor. Now, treatment toxicity is also of great importance. I will ask you to concentrate on the last 2 columns of this table, which describes on the left adverse events seen in 980 women younger than 75, and in the last column, adverse events seen in 125 women older than 75. What we can see is that adverse events leading to dose reduction or interruption were experienced at higher rates in older women. In particular, we can see here that treatment discontinuation occurred in 32% of the older women, compared to 12% for the younger women. The rate of serious adverse event was 46% in the older women, compared to 23% in the younger women. There was also slightly more hepatotoxicity, grade 3-4 in older women. There was more fatigue of all grades, and there was also more diarrhea of all grades, and slightly more diarrhea, grade 3. So, what are the messages for clinical practice? We can say that the efficacy of the CDK4/6 inhibitors is maintained in older women, but the side effects are enhanced. It is important to remember that we are talking here about older women involved in clinical trials, which means women with a very good performance status and few or no comorbidities. An important message for clinicians is that in these older women, it will be important to monitor side effects more closely in the first weeks of therapy, and in particular, monitor fatigue and diarrhea. Let us now move to our second target population, women treated at academic centers without being entered in clinical trials, obviously. Here we have 3 available studies, 2 from the United States, 1 from Europe. It is important to stress that these 3 studies are very different. The largest one from the Cleveland Clinic reported outcomes in 411 women who had a relatively poor performance status and who were heavily pretreated, since a quarter of these women received the CDK inhibitor as 4th line. We see that we have approximately 23% of these patients with de novo metastatic breast cancer, and about 1/3 of these women had either bone-only disease or visceral disease, which is what we expect. The cohort of women receiving an aromatase inhibitor and palbociclib comprised 226 women. The median progression-free survival overall was 9 months, and in first line, it was 15 months, which is definitely worse than the median progression-free survival reported in PALOMA-2, which was 26 months. In the cohort of women treated in the real world with fulvestrant and palbociclib, 158 women, the median progression-free survival was 10 months, 12 months if the treatment was given in the first line, and this is more in line with what has been reported from the PALOMA-3 trial. Unfortunately, in this study, data on treatment side effects were incomplete, but it was reassuring to note that the discontinuation rate for adverse event was only 8%. Let us move now to the second US study from Ohio State University. This study enrolled 70 patients with an excellent performance status, and this was clearly a more homogeneous population since all these women received the CDK4/6 inhibitor as first line in combination with endocrine therapy. We see again the disease characteristics, which are more or less as expected: 40% de novo metastatic breast cancer, close to half of the patients with bone-only disease, and close to half of the patients with visceral metastasis. And here we see a median progression-free survival of 26 months, which is very close to the one reported from the PALOMA-2 trial. We also get information on doses given in this real-world setting. As you can see, 30% of patients had their final tolerated dose being 100 milligrams. 26% had their final tolerated dose being 75 milligrams. So these dose reductions are a little bit more frequent than what was reported in the clinical trials, but as we will see in a few minutes, this had no impact on the efficacy of the treatment. And finally, the smallest trial from the Netherlands is a trial which reported the outcome of 46 women with an excellent performance status again, but receiving the treatment in first, second, or third line. All these patients, but 5, received fulvestrant in combination with palbociclib, and we can see a median progression-free survival, very satisfactory, of 10 months, which is close to what has been reported in the PALOMA-3 study. Of note, there were not many dose reductions or interruptions in this European study. These are interesting data from the Ohio State University study, in which they compared the outcome of patients who were able to stay at the recommended dose of palbociclib of 125 milligrams, the black curves, to the outcome of women who had to experience a dose reduction down to 100 or 75 milligrams. The message of these curves is straightforward. There are, in fact, no statistical differences between these curves, implying that a reduction in the dose of palbociclib will not lead to a reduced efficacy in terms of progression-free survival, which is an important information for clinicians in clinical practice. These curves were generated by the Dutch study. On the left, the authors have compared the progression-free survival curves from PALOMA-3 to the progression-free survival curve of their series of 46 real-world patients. The red curve shows the outcome of patients in PALOMA-3 who received endocrine treatment alone. And the two upper curves, which are superimposable, represent the outcome of patients receiving the CDK4/6 inhibitor, either in the context of the trial or in the real-world setting. What we now see on the right is the difference in outcome between women of the Dutch study who satisfied the eligibility criteria of PALOMA-3 compared to the women in the Dutch study who did not satisfy these eligibility criteria, either because they had a somewhat lower performance status or because they were more extensively pretreated. For example, some of these women were exposed to fulvestrant previously, or even to everolimus. And what we see is not surprising. For the women who did not match the eligibility criteria of PALOMA-3, the progression-free survival curve is slightly worse compared to the women of the real-world setting who matched the eligibility criteria of the clinical trial. Let us now move to our third target population, women treated in community practices. Here we have 3 studies with a total number of real-world patients of 2,158. The largest study, comprising 1,388 women, describes the outcome of patients treated either with letrozole and palbociclib or letrozole alone in the first-line setting. The second study, which comprises 652 patients, reports the outcomes of patients treated either with an aromatase inhibitor and palbociclib or fulvestrant and palbociclib. This is the IRIS study. Finally, the third study, the smallest one, interestingly reports on the outcome of real-world patients treated with abemaciclib in the United States. Of note, all these studies are industry-sponsored studies. Let us examine the data from the first study. There is, of course, a temptation to make a comparison between these two cohorts. But of course, this comparison is subjected to bias. In the first column, we see the outcome of patients treated with letrozole and palbociclib, 766 women. Their median age is as expected, 66 years. About a quarter have bone-only disease, half visceral disease, and 41% de novo metastatic breast cancer. The median follow-up is 22 months, and what we see is a very encouraging 3-year overall survival rate of 72%. If we now turn to the second cohort, 622 women receiving letrozole alone in first line, we see their median age of 70. 31% had bone-only disease, close to 50% visceral disease, close to 40% de novo metastatic breast cancer. The median follow-up is about 19 months, and we see a good 60% overall survival rate at 36 months. So the only thing we can say here is that it is encouraging to see that patients receiving palbociclib seem to do a little bit better than those who did not receive the CDK4/6 inhibitor. But once again, we are not authorized to make here a formal comparison. Let us turn now to the second study, the IRIS study, which consisted in a retrospective review of over 600 electronic health records. All these patients were treated at community practices in different regions of the United States. The first cohort received an aromatase inhibitor and palbociclib, 360 women. The median age was 66. And as expected, since these women received this combination as first line, almost none of these patients received a previous treatment for metastatic breast cancer. We see a high proportion of patients with de novo metastatic breast cancer, 65%, 43% had bone-only disease, and 50% visceral disease. The second cohort of 292 women received palbociclib and fulvestrant, median age 63. We see that a lower proportion of these women had prior adjuvant chemotherapy, suggesting that perhaps the disease was less aggressive in this second cohort of patients. Here, we are not surprised to see that a significant proportion of these women already were treated with endocrine treatment or even chemotherapy for their metastatic breast cancer. We have a lower proportion of de novo metastatic breast cancer, but we find again a substantial proportion of women with bone-only disease and visceral disease. The IRIS study gives interesting information on the way CDK4/6 inhibitors are prescribed by oncologists in a real-world setting. The left column refers to an aromatase inhibitor plus palbociclib, and the right column to fulvestrant plus palbociclib. And from the two pies that you can see on the slide, it appears that oncologists do respect the recommended initial dose of palbociclib, which is 125 milligrams daily. Indeed, this was the dose selected in approximately 3/4 of these real-world patients. What we also see is that dose modifications were required in less than 20% of the patients. These modifications, as we can see, consisted mainly in dose reductions. Interestingly, cycle delays were infrequent. Dose interruptions also did not occur very often. And interestingly, patients who started the treatment at a reduced dose of palbociclib occasionally could be escalated. Now, in terms of patient outcomes, as far as progression-free survival is concerned and overall survival is concerned, Let us start with the cohort of patients receiving an aromatase inhibitor and palbociclib, 360 patients. It is quite encouraging to see that 2/3 of these patients were progression-free at 24 months, and more than 90% were alive at 24 months. If we now turn to the combination of fulvestrant and palbociclib, where the follow-up is a little bit shorter, and where the treatment could be prescribed in first line or in later lines, we see that for first-line treatment, we have 90% of the patients progression-free at 12 months and also alive at 12 months. And we have 74% of patients progression-free at 12 months for the second or later line administration, and 86% of these patients alive at 12 months. So very good results, very much in line with what we have seen in the randomized clinical trials. Let us now describe the third study from community practices in the United States. It's an interesting study, even if it is small, because it describes the real-world use of abemaciclib in the United States. As you can see, the median age of these women was 66. They had de novo metastatic breast cancer in 35% of the cases and visceral disease in 2/3 of the cases. Abemaciclib was given as first line in combination with endocrine treatment in 29% of those women, as second line in 21%, as third line in 20%, and as later line in 30%. And here we also had a small proportion of women receiving abemaciclib as a single agent. What is important to stress here, because it has not been the case in all the studies described before, these women were sometimes exposed to a different CDK4/6 inhibitor previously. A quarter, in fact, of the patients had seen either palbociclib or ribociclib before receiving abemaciclib. Also of note is the fact that here the preferred endocrine partner was fulvestrant. What about the prescription pattern and the anti-tumor activity seen? Once again, we see that oncologists in the United States respect the recommended dose of abemaciclib, which is 150 milligram BID given continuously. This was indeed the dose prescribed initially to 81% of these patients. 8% of the patients received a somewhat higher dose, and 8% received a lower dose. Interestingly, dose reductions were only needed in 7% of these women. In terms of anti-tumor activity, not surprisingly, we see a trend for higher objective responses in women receiving abemaciclib in first line compared to second, third, or fourth line. It is still remarkable that 1 in 5 women benefits from this treatment, even if extensively pretreated. Let us move now to the fourth target population, heavily pretreated women. Here we do find 3 published studies, all from Europe. Unfortunately, the studies, as you can see, are pretty small. 2 are from Belgium, and one of those is from my institution, and one is from Croatia. What all these studies share in common is the fact that the patients here have received multiple lines of endocrine treatment and multiple lines of chemotherapy before receiving an endocrine agent plus a CDK4/6 inhibitor. And this, of course, explains the median progression-free survival, which are now in the range of 3 to 5 months. Nevertheless, we can say that some clinical benefit is seen in these heavily pretreated women when prescribed endocrine therapy plus a CDK4/6 inhibitor. What was also remarkable was the fact that none of the studies reported new safety signals or unusual toxicities. Last but not least, the target population of male patients with metastatic breast cancer. The rarity of breast cancer in men makes it very difficult to conduct randomized clinical trials specifically for this population. And this is why real-world data on male breast cancer patients, even if scarce, are very important and can be informative. In the present case, we have two sources of real-world data. The IQVIA analysis is a descriptive and retrospective analysis based on pharmacy and medical claims between 2010 and 2017 in the United States. Unfortunately, as you can see, at the end, only 47 patients prescribed palbociclib and endocrine therapy were retained in the analysis, and 238 prescribed endocrine treatment alone. Also problematic is the fact that we have very little information on the baseline characteristics of these male breast cancer patients. The second source of real-world data comes from the Flatiron Health Analysis, which is based on more than 2,500 electronic health records of male breast cancer patients treated in the United States between 2011 and 2017. Here again is a disappointment because, as you can see, only 12 patients prescribed palbociclib and endocrine therapy were retained in this analysis, and 16 patients prescribed endocrine treatment alone. And as we will see later on, the baseline characteristics of these two cohorts of patients were clearly unbalanced. So here are the data generated by the IQVIA analysis. And what we can see here is that the median prescription order duration is about twice as long when palbociclib is added to endocrine therapy as compared to endocrine therapy alone. We are talking here about 8.5 months compared to 4.3 months in first-line treatment and 2.7 months compared to 1 month in second-line treatment. It is interesting to note that endocrine treatment alone in these male breast cancer patients does not show very impressive clinical activity. It is entirely possible that a CDK4/6 inhibitor is of extreme added value in these patients, but this will of course require further study. Here we see the baseline characteristics of the two cohorts of the Flatiron analysis. First, the palbociclib cohort with 12 patients, and just next to it, the endocrine cohort with 16 patients. And unfortunately, what we can say is that patients in the palbociclib cohort probably have more aggressive disease, they are younger, and they receive the treatment very often as third or fourth line. For the patients treated with endocrine treatment alone, we can see that there were more patients with de novo metastatic breast cancer. So it's clearly going to be difficult to make comparisons between these two cohorts. In any case, these comparisons are not valid because we don't talk here about a randomized clinical trial. Nevertheless, what we can see is that in terms of objective response rate, we have a better activity of endocrine treatment and palbociclib, presumably, compared to endocrine treatment alone. Once again, endocrine treatment alone appears to be poorly effective in these male breast cancer patients with a response rate of only 12.5%. These male breast cancer patients received aromatase inhibitors or sometimes fulvestrant. I think it is interesting to remind everyone that the FDA approved a supplemental new drug application for palbociclib in men with hormone receptor-positive HER2 negative advanced breast cancer in combination with an aromatase inhibitor or fulvestrant. And the justifications are as follows. First, the very favorable benefit versus risk documented in women with this disease. And second, the real-world data on male patients that we just saw, even if they are considered to be quite limited. Additionally, an important consideration was also the fact that no new safety signals were reported in men treated with CDK4/6 inhibitors. Let us now close with our SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, timely. What are the take-home messages from this exercise? I hope I've convinced you that real-world data do supplement the information generated by randomized clinical trials, and in the specific case of CDK4/6 inhibitors, given in combination with endocrine therapy for advanced luminal breast cancer, they give us confidence that the treatment can be given in a broader population than the one typically included in the randomized clinical trials. Of course, we have seen that prior treatment and performance status are important and will influence the success of this treatment. Remarkably, we have also seen that in terms of toxicity, no new safety signals have emerged. As a matter of fact, the toxicity seen in the real-world patients is very similar to the one reported in the clinical trials. In particular, there have been no cases of febrile neutropenia reported and no cases of pulmonary emboli. Thank you very much for your kind attention.